Welcome back to the Rise with Anita Podcast, or welcome if you're new here. This is a space where ambition meets embodiment, where soul meets strategy, and where we don't just talk about transformation, we learn how to actually live it. So today's episode is for the woman who might find herself asking, why does this still bother me? Maybe it's a person. Maybe it's a relationship. Maybe it's a comment someone had made. Maybe it's a situation you've thought you've already healed from. And yet, when any of these things come up, you still feel activated. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions in the healing and personal development spaces is that we assume healing means we'll never be triggered or activated again. That if we've truly done the work, we'll finally get to a place where we become completely unbothered. But what if that's not actually the goal? What if the goal isn't to never be triggered, but rather to become neutral? Because when something is truly healed, it no longer carries a charge. The spark is gone. And it's not necessarily that you've forgotten, and we're not talking about suppressing it, but rather because it no longer has that same power over you. And that's what I want to talk about today. But before we dive in, you already know I like to arrive together. So if you're able to, please place your feet on the ground, close your eyes, relax your shoulders, unclench the jaw, and take a slow inhale for 4 through the mouth. Hold for 4, 2, 3, 4. And release through the mouth for 6. Again, breathing in through the nose for 4. Hold for 4. Release through the mouth for 6. And just notice, how am I arriving in this moment? You don't need to change anything. Just create an awareness. And from that place, we begin. I think we usually measure healing incorrectly. And I've been guilty of this too. Because we tend to think healing means I don't think about it anymore. It doesn't affect me. Or I don't see the impact. I never get triggered about it anymore. But realistically, that's not how healing actually works. Because healing isn't necessarily about erasing the memory. It's about moving the charge. Removing the charge. So the memory can still exist. The lesson can still exist. The experience can still matter, but it no longer owns you. So I'll give you a personal example. For years, one of the deepest wounds I've been navigating and healing from is the wound around my relationship with my father and him leaving. And it has nothing to do with just the event itself. And I will say, going forward, that relationship has been one of my greatest teachers. Because that relationship became such a mirror for where I was in my growth journey. And while having the father wound has been very difficult, especially when I made an effort to be in relationship with him, the wound would come back in different stages of this mirroring that we had. And a lot of the times, I would find myself almost envious or even jealous, if I'm being transparent, of his daughter who got to live with him and have him be a present father figure and do everything that a father does. And so personally, for me, that event and what I was making it mean would translate into I wasn't enough and I somehow had to prove my worth in order to be loved. And I was trying to earn love from him and from just the people around me. And I'm not saying that I was not loved, but the story I had created was I'm not enough. I wasn't chosen, so I need to earn it. And so anytime I would hear anything about, especially the younger daughter who lived at home, there would be a charge. There would be this feeling of she gets the better version of him and I don't. And this is me coming on here being very vulnerable with you guys. But I remember having a conversation with him a couple of years ago. And he had told me some great news about her and where she was in her life. And he was so excited for her. And where I would have that normal longing for that father-daughter relationship. And where I would have felt the initial trigger of, wow, you're telling me this great news. Her life is in such a different place than mine is currently. And I would compare. Instead, I had genuine happiness for her. I wished her all the best in her news. And I told him, I was very happy. But reflecting after the fact, when I was sitting through that conversation, I didn't feel the charge. And I could recognize when I didn't feel that charge and I felt completely neutral. There was no triggering in that moment, that it was a new layer of healing because it felt good. So oftentimes, especially in personal development, we are looking for high highs or comparing our low lows to the high highs. And sometimes I think if we can just get ourselves to feel neutral, where it's not necessarily sexy, but if you feel neutral, you don't feel the charge, it's a much better place to be in. So, because over time, through healing, through nervous system work, through emotional processing, a lot of self-awareness, I recognized the story I had didn't necessarily disappear. It still affects me to this day. The memories didn't disappear, but that charge did disappear. And I could start to feel and listen to him speak about it, or I could actually rehash it personally without being consumed by it. And that's when I realized that is actual healing. And the easiest way I can explain this through the idea of the spark is when something still has any form of charge, whether you're excited or it's a reaction, an activation, a sensation in your body. It might be tightness or some sort of emotional pull. Your story begins to run. Someone can say something that can spark it. And you'll see a person's name that could spark something. You get criticism that can spark it. And you don't always get the response you want that can spark it. So oftentimes we think about these different triggers and we think, how can we eliminate the trigger? When reality is, the goal isn't to eliminate the situation, but really to eliminate the charge and the response to the situation. Because life is always going to present situations that are there to challenge us, to help us grow, to help us be a better version of ourselves. And people are going to be people. We can't control them. We can only control how we respond to them. So, if triggers are going to happen, and they will, the real question then becomes, how much charge is still attached to it? Because healing isn't always about removing the trigger, it's about removing the charge. So this is where my passion for nervous system work really becomes so important, because your trigger isn't necessarily showing you what's dangerous, though a lot of times that's where our nervous system is trying to protect. It's actually showing you what your body is perceiving as dangerous. So a trigger is often an old emotional story or a memory meeting a present day experience. And that's why two people can have the exact same experience and they can have the same situation present itself, but have completely different reactions. One person can receive feedback and experience it in one way where they're open to it or they're moving on from it. Another person can create a story where it's then causing them to question their own worth. The difference isn't the event. The difference is the meaning that they are attaching to it. And when we begin to create safety in the body, when we start to actually sit with how can I make myself feel safe in this moment, the charge starts to slowly soften. The nervous system stops responding as though it's under attack, and eventually the charge does disappear. And one thing I really want to say is a lot of times nervous system work is slow. It's not an overnight process. But with incremental change in the nervous system, you can really start to feel a different response. But I want to be very clear. When I say neutral, it does not mean numb. Neutrality isn't pretending that you no longer care or bypassing what feelings you would have had. Neutrality is about acknowledging something without it actually activating you and emotionally hijacking your experience. You still remember it. You understand. You learn from it, but it no longer controls your emotional state. Because of that, you're not in a state of suppression. Suppression says, I don't really care. Neutrality says, I've made my peace with it. Very different energies. So, I want to give you guys a tactical example before we land. And it's, think about someone that you might have texted and they haven't texted you back. Years ago, you might have spiraled. You might have made it into a story of, what did I do wrong? Are they upset with me? Did I say something wrong? And suddenly you've created this whole narrative around your worth. And maybe the same thing happens now, and you just simply notice it. They haven't responded yet. That's it. There is no emotional avalanche. There is no assuming anything about your self-worth, so you're no longer self-abandoning. There is no spiral. The circumstance hasn't changed, but your relationship to it did. And that's the healing. So I think so much of the time we spend chasing breakthroughs, we miss the quieter signs of healing, because healing isn't always a massive emotional release, though it can look like that. Sometimes healing is hearing the thing that used to trigger you and feeling neutral or nothing, or feeling like you're in a state of acceptance. Not resentment, not anger, not shame. not coming from a place of making it anything about your worth. Just peace. And that can almost feel anticlimactic, but it's actually freedom. Because when something no longer creates a reaction in your system, it no longer controls your life. So if there's something in your life right now that's still creating a charge or a activation, I don't want you to judge yourself for it either. I want you to become curious. Ask yourself, what meaning am I putting here? What is the story I have attached to this? What is my nervous system protecting me from? And what would neutrality look like for me in this situation? Because the goal isn't perfection. The goal isn't to become emotionless. The goal is freedom. And often freedom looks like a lot of neutrality. So if this episode resonated, please share it with someone who needs the reminder that healing isn't about never feeling. It's about no longer being controlled by what you feel. And until next time, that's it for this episode.